What's up, everybody? Today I want to make a video sort of about one of my favorite books, Capital by Karl Marx. And it's a big one, and there's 3 volumes and tons of shit in there. But I do want to sort of go over a little bit of it. Maybe read the first page and a half, and then sort of give you a summary of what you can expect from the first 4 chapters. And hopefully by the end of it, you decide to maybe give it a chance, give it a read, because it's really good. It's a really good book, and it explains a lot. And so I think we should just get right into it. And there we go. So I want to start just by reading maybe the first page, page and a half, just to sort of go over, because there's a lot in the first page. For example, we start on chapter 1, the commodity, the 2 factors of the commodity, use value and value. So, goes into the first paragraph. The wealth of societies in which the capitalist mode of production prevails appears to be an immense collection of commodities. The individual commodity appears as its elementary form, and our investigation, therefore, begins with the analysis of the commodity. The commodity is, first of all, an external object, a thing which through its qualities satisfies human needs of whatever kind. The nature of these needs, whether they arise, for example, from the stomach or the imagination, makes no difference. Nor does it matter how the thing satisfies man's needs, whether directly as a means of subsistence, i.e., an object of consumption, or indirectly as a means of production. Every useful thing, for example, iron, paper, etc., may be looked at from the 2 points of view of quality and quantity. Every useful thing is a whole composed of many properties. It can therefore be useful in various ways. The discovery of these ways, and hence of the manifold uses of things, is the work of history. So also is the invention of socially recognized standards of measurement for the quantities of these useful objects. The diversity of the measures for commodities arises in part from the diverse nature of the objects being measured, and in part from convention. The usefulness of a thing makes its use value, but this usefulness does not dangle mid-air. It is conditioned by the physical properties of the commodity, and has no existence apart from the latter. It is therefore the physical body of the commodity itself. For instance, iron, corn, a diamond, which is the use value or the useful thing. This property of a commodity is independent of the amount of labor required to appropriate its useful qualities. When examining use values, we always assume that we are dealing with definite quantities, such as dozens of watches, yards of linens, or tons of iron. The use values of commodities provide the material for a special branch of knowledge, namely the commercial knowledge of the commodities. Use values are only realized in use or in consumption. They constitute the material content of wealth, whatever its social form may be. In the form of society to be considered, there are also the material bearers of exchange value. Exchange value appears first of all as the quantitative relation, the proportion in which use values of one kind exchange for the use values of another kind. This relation changes constantly from time and place, hence exchange values appear to be something accidental and purely relative, and consequently an intrinsic value, i.e., an exchange value that is inseparably connected with the commodity inherent to it, seems a contradiction in terms. Let's consider the matter more closely. So, what is he necessarily talking about? So in this first paragraph, he's talking about commodities and what they are. So he sort of goes through a roundabout. We can sort of simplify it to say that commodities are a object that, the general definition that people use is an object that was designed to be sold. So it's an object that's in creation. It was created in order to be sold off. What he's talking about here is use values and exchange values. So a commodity is something that was created solely for its exchange value and not necessarily for a use value. He goes on later to say that all commodities need a use value or else nobody would buy them. But most things are made purely based on their exchange value of so what you can get for it, what you can sell it for. And so he has this very on the very first page he creates this separation between a use value and an exchange value. And a use value is going to be the thing, what the thing can do. So coats keep you warm, food fills your belly, you know, jewelry makes you look pretty. Those are the use values of those commodities. Whereas exchange values are a little bit different. It's a lot of people will simplify it to price, but that's a grave mistake. Exchange value is not price, never will be. They're not the same thing. They're very distinct, and the way they work, they need to be sort of distinct. And he goes on later about that. But an exchange value is what you can trade its value in exchange. So you can say, you know, a barrel of apples is worth 2 barrels of bananas, and that's its exchange values. It has an exchange value of 2 barrels of bananas or whatever, and so it's not necessarily have anything to do with what its purpose is. So you can say that customers are concerned with use values, whereas merchants are concerned with exchange values. And so he goes on about that in the first chapter, and then he also talks later on about the labor theory of value and how for something to have a value, there needs to have been labor that was put into it. And this makes sense if you think about it. So everything that's ever made, everything we buy, is a product of someone's labor. Someone did work to get that to you in a usable form. And so how valuable that thing is really depends on how much labor was put into it. He goes on to talk about how, if you can trade things, what exactly, we'll go to my bad example, what exactly makes 1 barrel of apples worth 2 barrels of bananas? And he goes in and he says, well, that what are the similarities? And we can find similarities with all commodities through labor. So all of them are products of human labor. And so his saying, if the same amount of labor went into making 1 barrel of apples that went into making 2 barrels of bananas, then you would have the same value. The same amount of socially necessary labor time went into those things. And so that's sort of what the first chapter is all about. Just to go on to the second chapter, it's called The Process of Exchange. And in that he talks sort of about how exchange happens between different commodities. At what point do we need money? And something I've heard before is the second chapter. It really sets up the framework for how a market economy is going to work and how commodities are going to be exchanged for other commodities. And so that's sort of what the second chapter is about. The third chapter is called Money, or the Circulation of Commodities, and that goes deep into money, mainly metallic money. And it's kind of a hard chapter. It's known for being a little bit more difficult than the chapters around it, but he talks a lot about how one commodity comes in and it represents all the other commodities. So you have gold, which he talks about a lot. He uses gold as his main money commodity, but it really doesn't have to be money. It can be a lot of different things. I think one of the most interesting things about this chapter is how he sort of goes on about money needing a metallic basis, or just a valuable commodity basis. But we live in a new world where money doesn't actually mean anything or have a value in itself. It's all paper money. And he sort of, you know, living in the 1800s says that, money's always going to need some sort of real commodity basis behind it, something with a use value. But, a lot of people thought that right up until it happened, and then it didn't happen. And so we now have a society where having gold money or silver or having our money backed up with the metal just isn't what we do. And so it's interesting to see at what points he was wrong about that, and at other points what things he was right about, and how later society after he died was able to go past metals and have a purely paper money economy. He talks a little bit about paper money, but yeah, he very specifically says that paper money can't exist on its own, and that ended up not being the case. And so that's kind of interesting. And then the last one that I really want to talk about is chapter 4, called The General Formula for Capital. And he talks about different relationships. So you have, because capital is a value that's put in motion to do things. And so you have the general formula for capital. He starts out talking about commodities, and you exchange commodities for money, which you then exchange for commodities. So you can look at this in the terms of the worker. The worker has one commodity, their labor power, their ability to do labor, and then they exchange that for money, and then they use that money to buy commodities to feed themselves and clothe themselves and to find housing and to raise their children. And so they live in a CMC sort of arrangement. But you can also have a different arrangement if you just kind of, and that goes back and forth. You can also look at it from an MCM arrangement. So you have money, you use that money to buy a group of commodities. If you're a capitalist, you buy, you're looking to make chairs or whatever, you buy wood, you buy glue, you buy nails, you buy the building to build this in, and then you also have to buy labor power. All commodities you need to buy labor power. And so he talks about how capitalists can live in an MCM sort of path, and that would just go on, and then the money would turn into a commodity and then turn into money. But that actually doesn't make a lot of sense in a business perspective, because if you have money and then you buy commodities, and then out of those commodities you get the same amount of money back, what was the point? Like, you're in this to make money. And so this sort of arrangement isn't very popular, and it leads directly into the next arrangement, the MCM prime. And so you have money, you change it for commodities, and then when you change it back into money, you're hoping to have more money than when you started out. And so you're looking to have a difference. So you want MC and then M plus a little bit more on top of that. And so he touches on that, and how, and I think he uses that mainly to show how in order to get that money, it doesn't just come from nowhere. It isn't spawned into existence. It comes from a certain commodity, mainly human labor, that when it's used, it produces more value than what it has of itself. So you can imagine the worker as a commodity. Well, not the worker himself, because that's slavery, but their labor power. You can consider that you buy that, and then when you use that labor power as a capitalist, the amount of value you get out of it is more than what it had itself. So the worker produces not only enough to pay for himself or herself, they also produce more than what it takes to reproduce the worker. And so that's where you get the M prime relationship. And then he touches on this very briefly at the end of the chapter, but he goes on to a different arrangement. It's called an M to M prime relationship. So this is sort of the case for interest-bearing capital. And so you would have money, and then you would directly give that money, and then you would later get that money back with a little bit more on top. And you didn't have to go through the C part. That's someone else's job. You just have money, and then you wait a little while and you have more money. And so he talks about that a lot in volume 3. That's sort of, he puts off a lot of the credit system and the interest-bearing capital and the merchant's capital. He puts all of that off until the 3rd volume, but he briefly touches on it here. But that's sort of all I wanted to talk about today. Please read this book. I might make a video talking about the next few chapters in the book, but I feel like for now this is a lot of information. He kind of throws it at you, but the book's really, really great. He's an awesome author. He everything he says is really interesting. He has a very unique way of stating things, and it's a little bit dense. It's a little bit archaic, and he's gonna talk about things from his day. He talks a lot about other economists, other political economists from his time. And so you sort of have to either brush over that or have a little, there's a lot of helpful information in the footnotes and things like that to really understand. But yeah, so I hope you liked this video. If you have any questions or comments or feedback, please let me know. Leave a comment, and I will catch you in the next one. Thank you.